Well, good evening, everybody. I know people are logging into the meeting and joining. I didn't want to wait too long before getting started. I wanted to introduce myself to those who I may not have had a chance to meet. My name is Alyssa Choi, and I'm the governor of the Massachusetts ACP chapter. And I am really pleased to see our chapter hosting this educational opportunity to discuss a very important topic. And really grateful to, first off, Dr. Partna Bardwaj, who has been an exemplary leader in our chapter and who has been such a proactive member of our chapter in constantly thinking of activities that will support our membership. And this is one of her many contributions to our chapter's activities. And I also wanted to thank each and every one of the panelists this evening and thank all of you for your interests, and want to, without further delay, welcome you all. Thank you for your participation, and turn it over to Dr. Partna Bardwaj, who is our current chair of the Council of Resident Fellow Members and a Hematology Oncology Fellow at Bay State Medical Center, who will be moderating tonight's events. Thank you, Dr. Bardwaj.
Thank you, Dr. Choi, for such a kind introduction. I wanted to welcome you all to this panel discussion. I think it's a very timely panel discussion, especially as a lot of people start to look for jobs. I wanted to start this session with introducing our panelists first, and then we'll talk a little bit about some housekeeping rules for this particular session. And then we'll dive into a brief introduction on the J1 waiver process, and we will open up the floor for some questions from audience as well. So first of all, to start off, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Raghuvir Rakasi, who completed his residency in internal medicine and a fellowship in geriatrics. He actually completed his J1 waiver job as a primary care physician at Caring Health Center in Springfield, Massachusetts, and subsequently transitioned to a hospitalist job, initially at Bay State Franklin Medical Center, and then at Bay State Medical Center, and now serves as the medical director for the oncology unit at Bay State. Welcome, Dr. Rakasi.
Thank you, Doctor.
I next have Ms. Elissa Taub, who is a partner with the immigration law firm Siskind and Sassa, and leads the firm's healthcare immigration practice group. Her work focuses primarily on immigration matters for physicians and other healthcare professionals. And she's also the co-author of the Physician Immigration Handbook. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Next, I have Dr. Camille Edwards, who completed a fellowship in hematology oncology at Boston Medical Center and is now an assistant professor of medicine at Boston University School of Medicine. She currently maintains a clinical practice in hematology at Boston Medical Center and is an active member for students and residents with a strong passion for teaching. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I have Dr. Alok Khole, who has completed his internal medicine residency and chief residency at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, followed by an infectious diseases fellowship from UMass Medical Center. During his fellowship, he served as the co-chair of the Massachusetts ACP Council of Resident Fellow Members. And as a matter of fact, Dr. Khole and I started this particular group at the ACP Massachusetts together. He currently works as an ID consultant as well as the physician lead for the hospital epidemiology, infection prevention, and antimicrobial stewardship programs at Cheshire Medical Center, probably very busy during the pandemic as well. And this is an affiliate of the Dartmouth Hitchcock Health System. So thank you for joining us today, Alok.
Thanks so much for having me, and good to see everyone again.
Yeah. So with that introduction, I wanted to just discuss some basic rules for this particular session. I would request that all of you mute your Zoom, other than, of course, our panel members. Please feel free to use the chat box to type in any questions, and we'll try our best to answer all of these. And please note that this discussion in this conference does not represent national ACP policy or the views of the institutions that our panelists belong to. These are individual experiences that our panel members have very graciously agreed to share with all of us who are going through a similar experience. And with that, I would like to get started with today's session. So I wanted to give a brief overview of what to expect with the J1 waiver process and ask a couple of questions along the way to our panelists. So as you're all probably well aware, J1 visa is an exchange visitor visa, which essentially allows you to train, complete your residency, fellowships, etc., and requires you to go back to your home country for 2 years following completion of your training. Now, when this is not feasible, or if a few people choose not to do so, the US does have a program in place where you have the ability to work in an underserved area for a total of 3 years in place of the 2-year home requirement, working at least 40 hours per week. There are multiple agencies that do a J1 waiver program. I think the most popular and the common one that we've all heard of is the Conrad 30 program. And this was really introduced in the 1990s by Senator Conrad from North Dakota, who had a lot of issues hiring physicians and really retaining doctors in North Dakota. And the heart of the J1 waiver program is to really get physicians out to areas with physician shortages or to medically underserved areas. And each of the 50 states have 30 spots that they can utilize in any way that they deem fit for medically underserved areas in the state. For example, I think there are some states like California and New Jersey that predominantly focus on primary care as that's their need. Whereas there are some states like Montana that might be more flexible about who can come to the state, predominantly due to not being able to fill most of their spots. Once primary care spots are filled, later in the year, there might be opportunities for specialists to take these jobs if there are any spots that are available. And every state has their own individual way of going about this process. I believe some states have a lottery-based system in terms of choosing physicians, whereas some do a first-come, first-served basis. And for Conrad 30, your workplace needs to be physically located in an underserved area. And this can be found on the Google HPSA website. And typically, they take applications September or October of the year before you start your job. So now I know that there are, state-specific websites for J1 waiver. But for somebody who's starting a job search, panelists, what would you recommend in terms of resources? Do you know of any websites or resources where you might be able to find all of this information in the same place? What are some of the resources that each of you used while you were trying to navigate this process? Dr. Rakasi, do you want to start? You look like you have an answer.
Sure. Yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't find one particular site where we have all the information about the states in a real time, but few legal firms and one of the site called 3rnet.org, I found information related to prior years slots, each state, how many slots were filled and how many were assigned to primary care or subspecialty, and which subspecialty and how many were left over. So there were information about the past few years, which kind of gives us an idea about which states are better we could target. But I didn't find any particular site with the real-time information.
I think something that I used personally was it's if you really have certain states in mind, either because you're geographically restricted because of family or your significant others, job requirements, or whatever the case might be. There are some states whose own sort of public health or these sort of program websites have that information for you as well with respect to past trends, what their preferences are, what their current process is. Depending upon where you're in the process, they may also give real-time information about how many slots are filled and how many are still vacant. Like, for example, when I was looking for jobs and I was sort of gravitating towards New Hampshire, the New Hampshire DHHS website gives you a very clear breakdown about how many slots are filled, and that's sort of updated on a once in 2 weeks basis just to keep everyone up to speed. And it also depends on the timeline of that process, depending upon which state you're looking at. So I think, and there are some websites which will try and consolidate this information about who are your points of contact for specific states. at least in my experience, when I emailed those particular individuals, you may not hear from them the next day, but some of them are pretty good enough to reply to you about where they're at. At times you may get template replies, but I think it's just a part of the process.
So I can hop in as well. So it was mentioned earlier, I'm the co-author of the Physician Immigration Handbook. And we've been publishing this book. This, I think, is going to be coming up in January. The 6th edition is going to come out. And it is your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about the process. And in the back of the book, there are charts. There's a 50-state chart that surveys every single state and the basics of their J1 waiver program. Do they support specialists? Are there any special rules about that? When do they start accepting applications? Is it a lottery or first come, first serve? Who's the contact person at the state? What's their website? We try to track as much of that information as possible. Of course, it's a print book. It's also available as an ebook. But the fact that it's a print book means that sometimes that information might change during the year. And so we can't update it in real time, but that information is there. And if you find that information in that chart is incorrect, I mean, we track it constantly during the year so that every year as the new edition of the book comes out, we update it. The other thing we do in our office is we actually reach out to a variety of states periodically during the year to find out what their slot availability is. Sometimes we're doing that because our clients ask us to, but there are some states where we're big filers and we want to make sure that we're keeping up with their availability. So if you are talking with an immigration attorney, it's possible that they may have that information. It just may not be published because it's really hard to update all of that online at the same time you're trying to do work for your clients. But we do, keep a handle on that. And I just want to mention one other thing real quick, because I think that was a great introduction to the J1 waiver process. And I just wanted to add in a quick little bite about the fact that not all waivers have to be in underserved areas. Through the Conrad 30 program, every state has the option to issue up to 10 flex waivers every year. And there's always some confusion about what is really flex. Is it a specialist waiver or what is it? But the true definition of flex is that it's for a physician who's not working in an underserved area, but that facility or that practice attracts a certain threshold percentage of underserved patients. Not every state uses them. The states that do use them all have different requirements or rules about how to qualify. But I just wanted to clarify that you may look at a situation that's not underserved and still have the ability to do a flex waiver. So don't, and I know, like you mentioned, New Jersey is a state that does use all 10 of its flex waivers. So that's certainly an option in some places.
Thank you so much, Ms. Staub. I think it's really helpful to have a lawyer's perspective on this particular process as well. Dr. Edwards, did you want to comment on this as well?
Oh, well, just to comment on what was said before, I did use some of the same websites that were mentioned and strongly recommend going through the Department of Public Health in the particular state that you are looking to apply for a job. So that was a great recommendation there. And then lastly, just to what Ms. Taub was saying, that I have some personal experience with regards to the flex waiver, and that not every J1 waiver job is necessarily in a physical underserved area, but serves underserved patients.
Thank you. So I think that kind of also leads up to, what other agencies are there for a waiver process, because it's not just the Conrad 30 program that does J1 waivers. So the second agency that we know of is the HHS pathway. And I think primarily it's for primary care specialties like internal medicine, pediatrics, OB-GYN, psychiatry, and family medicine. Initially, these were primarily at federally qualified health centers, but more recently, they are done at organizations which are not federally qualified health center, but has an HPSA score of 7 or more. Now, if you Google HPSA and go to their website and put in the name of the institution, it can give you what the HPSA score is, and that can help you make a decision in terms of a job search. Now, there's no cap or timeline for this particular waiver, which means that you can submit your application at any time. I am not 100% certain about this, but HHS does have a clinical and research pathway, where I think the research pathway would allow you to work at a university or research facility if this research is of national or international significance. I think I see already a comment in the chat about what an HPSA score is. I think that's essentially a professional physician shortage in or medically underserved area. They have a scoring system between, I believe, 0 to 100 or 0 to 26. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alyssa.
26.
26. I think the other one is 0 to 100. So yeah, so 0 to 26 and anything more than 7 qualifies for an HPSA or medically underserved area where you can find a job. Now, the other agency is the Delta Regional Authority, and it's very specific to certain geography within the US. This, once again, doesn't have a timeline and can be applied for at any time. And based on some of the research that I did, it sounded like this is one agency where you may be able to change your employer as long as they all fall under the Delta Regional Authority without a major penalty. And my understanding is that this does both primary care and subspecialty. Now, coming to the next waiver agency available, it's the Appalachian Regional Commission, and this has 13 states and has its own website. And this essentially includes counties on either side of the Appalachian Trail, and predominantly does primary care, but can do specialties as well, and has an unlimited number of waivers. So you may be in a situation where a particular organization may qualify for both CONRAD and DRA, or the Appalachian Regional Commission. So you may definitely want to look into which waiver you want to use based on like the pros and cons of each kind of waiver, keeping in mind that CONRAD 30 has a very specific timeline for it, unlike some of the other agencies. Now, the last agency that I have come across was the Veterans Affairs. I think this has its pros and cons based on what I was reading, and it sounds like they don't start your process until about 6 months before you actually start your job, and they need to continue trying to hire a US citizen. The paperwork with the VA can be slow. They do not pay attorney fees, but it can be an attractive option for a lot of people because it may allow you to work at academic medical centers in cities which may otherwise not necessarily be feasible. And I've also heard that there's no malpractice and they have really good retirement benefits. It can be risky to pursue as it can be filled by a citizen at any point of time, which may leave you without a job sometimes. However, this is definitely a way that a lot of people have done J1 waiver jobs. So I think that's really like, the various J1 waiver agencies in a nutshell. What happens once you find a job and, what happens once, an employer files for a J1 waiver? Alyssa, are you able to comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, happy to. So the J1 waiver process is, kind of lengthy. It'll probably take the better part of your entire last year of your residency or fellowship to go through this process. And you really, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit along the way, but the earlier you find a job, the more choices you have in terms of where your waiver might be. As was said earlier, some states fill up very quickly, all 30 of their slots, some don't. So it's, once you kind of sign a contract, and things will kind of proceed from there. So the first thing to know is that an employment agreement with a 3-year term for full-time work in whatever the location is going to be is an absolute requirement to file for a waiver. So in our office, our trigger point for starting the waiver process and helping to prepare that application is the doctor signing of the contract. Once the contract is signed, then we send out the list of documents and information that we will need for whatever program that you're filing in. So I file waivers all over the United States. And so we have intake documentation for every single one of the programs that we file in. And so we'll kind of lead you. And then at the same time, we're going to work on the other side with the employer to get everything that we need from them. So it's sort of two sides of the same coin. Once all of that documentation is ready, we will submit it with the state. And as we talked about earlier, all 50 states plus all these federal programs all have different rules and filing procedures. So, it's very important not to generalize or assume that what's right in one place is going to be right in another. So that's one of the things that we're experts in, is figuring out what do we need to file and when. So we'll go ahead and get the application filed. Again, we're going to talk a lot about variables and variations amongst programs throughout the country. Once you file, what happens? Well, in some places, like with an HHS clinical waiver, I'm probably going to hear back from them within a month of when I file, usually about 3 weeks. But when I file a waiver in the state of New York, their filing deadline is usually like the Tuesday or Wednesday right after Thanksgiving. And I'm not probably going to hear back from them until March or April. Very, very different processing times. So, depending on the program that you're going through, you may need to find a little bit of patience in waiting it out. Other programs are going to move through very, very quickly. Once the state, and I will mention that sometimes the state or the federal program will come back and ask some questions about your application. It doesn't mean anything was done incorrectly. There are some programs that are notorious for coming back, and no matter what you submit, they're gonna come back and ask you to fix or change something. But sometimes there are real questions that arise, and we kind of work through those. Once the state or federal agency recommends that your waiver be granted, they're going to forward your case to the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. And at that point, your waiver is going to meet up with all the other waivers from around the country. They all meet up there. The Department of State will review and recommend your waiver. They're going to send it on to the Immigration Service, USCIS, which is going to ultimately approve the waiver. But that's not really the end of the story, because as I like to tell folks, the waiver says you don't have to go home, but it doesn't let you stay here. So what ends up happening is at the end of the waiver process or late in the process, your employer is going to file a petition to change your immigration status in the U.S. from J1 to H1B, so that when you start your waiver job, you're going to work in H1B status. You won't be on that J anymore. So that's the full, so the process really isn't complete until your H1B is approved. And then when your start date comes, theoretically, you're eligible to start work. So those are all of the steps. And you can imagine with all of those government agencies, all of those applications, all of that coordination, it takes a while. This is not like a 2-week where, we file it and we're done process. It's gonna be some time.
Well, thank you so much for that really comprehensive answer. I do have some follow-up questions to that, but it looks like, our audience members already have a few questions, which I think we'll start taking, and then we'll move on with some of the other questions that I had. One of the questions that we got is primary care predominantly outpatient, or are hospitalist jobs also falling under this? Dr. Rakasi, do you think you'd be able to comment a bit on that?
Based on some of the friends and who got into hospitalist jobs in the underserved areas, I believe hospitalist job also comes under the primary care, particularly also recently in one of the facility where they did a HHS waiver for hospitalists, particularly nocturnists. So I believe it comes under the primary care.
Thank you. I think one of the other questions that we got is, does the whole J1 waiver process make it difficult to actually negotiate contracts with potential employers? Dr. Edwards, I'll have you start with it, and maybe Dr. Kohli can also kind of follow up with an answer for that.
I would say that's a potential myth. And you definitely want to, go for, if you're geographically limited, of course, that's understandable. But I think that is a potential myth. I don't think it makes it harder for the places that do J1 visas. Once you apply to a place that's able to do a J1 visa, it does not make it more difficult for you to negotiate a contract.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would second that. I will preface it by saying that, coming out of residency and or fellowship, intrinsically, you've never negotiated. For a lot of us, this is your first job. But the first mistake we do is to come out saying that I'm at the losing end, and which I think is a wrong mentality, which you'll realize 3 years into your job, is like you don't really have to start out with that. I think it's important to understand that as much as you need the job needs you as well, right? It's very different from residency and fellowship where you're trying to get a foot in the door. This is it's a job. At the end of the day, they need to hire someone. It's an underserved area and they need you as much as you need them. I think we have to be reasonable. You need not underestimate your potential by saying, oh, I'm on a waiver, so maybe I cannot negotiate and ask for what I should ask for. I think knowing your worth, learning from previous folks who've gone through it, and I will also say that if you really are not sure of how to go about it, I think it's important to sort of talk to, there are several firms out there which will sort of help you with the negotiations process and train you as to how to go about it. And I think that tends to be really helpful, but at no point should you believe that, let me just get through this and then I'll figure things out later. There's no reason to believe that.
So well said. I think having, going through this process myself right now, I'm a second-year fellow at Bay State in hematology oncology, and I'm starting my process now. And I keep thinking, hey, do you think it's going to be okay to ask people, my potential employers for these things? You're always so unsure because you don't really know what to expect. But that's so well said. Thank you.
I also could I just add also just to echo what he said, but also to say, employers who are open to filing J1 waivers or who do them regularly expect this to be part of the process. I regularly hear from doctors who are almost like afraid to tell an employer that they need a waiver, or they're afraid, they feel like, well, how am I going to find one of these jobs? How do they even exist? And they're plentiful. They're real. And, so don't sell yourself short. I think that is the best advice that anybody could give you. The jobs are there, and the employers are not gonna, if they can do it and if they're open to it, this is something that they expect out of their recruitment process. It's not going to be an unpleasant surprise.
That actually leads, a perfect segue to our next question. One of our audience members asked, what if a potential employer has limited experience with J1 visa waiver but meets requirements? Can the employer's lawyers collaborate with a firm that has the experience, or does it have to be done by the employer itself?
That's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of times for some of my clients, sometimes a case is brought to me through the employer. Sometimes a case is brought to me through the physician. And if it's an employer or practice that doesn't have a lot of experience with immigration, they may say to you, well, is there somebody that you want to use? Is there a lawyer that you know? And then you say, oh, yes, I know this lawyer, whoever it might be, and you can make a match. Typically, there's only one lawyer who prepares and files the waiver. There's not really a need to have more than one law firm involved. So in fact, it can be like really cumbersome and delay things if you have lots of lawyers in the mix. I would not recommend that, a corporation's corporate counsel who's never done this before learn with your case, in that you really do want an immigration attorney, and not just an immigration attorney, but an immigration attorney who has experience filing J1 waivers. You do not want to be the person that somebody dabbles with. It is not a good idea. So, I would definitely insist if, if a hospital or something says, oh, we haven't done one of these in like 10 years, but we have this in-house counsel who did it before, so she can figure it out, right? Like, probably, that should be a red flag. And you might say, I really would like to have an immigration lawyer, or at least consult with an immigration lawyer about this, so I know we're on the right page.
Excellent, thank you. Talking about red flags, are there any other red flags that you guys can think of where you think employers might be taking advantage of J1 waiver workers? That's one of the questions that we got.
Yeah, I think that's a loaded question in so many different ways, right?
Yes.
So I would say this, okay? There's always the risk But I don't think that risk begins and ends with J1 waivers. I think that risk can start off and end with any employee per se. It brings us back to the point of don't feel as if you're at a disadvantage because you're on a J1 waiver. I think what is extremely key is try and see what the history of that particular employer is with respect to J1 waiver workers. What's their retention capacity? Do people do their 3 years and look for the first opportunity to get out? That's something you want to look out for. If they retain some of these such that they end up staying in the community or moving on, but the employer is ready to share their information with you, always try and get that information and speak with those individuals and see what they have to say about the practice. They may give you the truth, they may not, because who knows what was written in their contract when they signed it. I think it's also important to see the overall work culture, the work ethic. You have to be a little more aware of everything that's happening, which can be a little intimidating if you're new to the process. But I think if you're careful about it, always try and look to speak with folks who have gone through that process with respect to that employer. I think that can go a long way in saving you from signing up for something that you shouldn't have.
And if I could just step in and reiterate that, that is extremely important. Two things that were mentioned. I think one of the biggest things about this process is actually, or, right at the beginning where you start to think about where you'd want to apply and what you'd want to do. And that, the mindset is very, very important, extremely important, and just not at every step of the way, not thinking that you are at a disadvantage just because of, sort of this process that you have to go through. And that's extremely important because you could miss red flags simply because of that. So definitely when you enter this process, really just enter it as a physician who is highly skilled, has gone through many years of training, and you've worked very hard and you deserve, the best. That's the first thing. And just sort of personal experience in terms of thinking about red flags. I think it's also very helpful to have a personal lawyer that would review your contract. I found that extremely helpful in the process. I know some residencies are a part of the Committee of Interns and Residents, who sometimes helps to subsidize legal services. So some people may be able to explore that particular option. But I think it's very important to also do your due diligence when you do get your contract as well, to have someone who's experienced, or even someone you trust if you're not able to necessarily go to a lawyer and review the contract specifically. And then finally, again, reiterating, absolutely 100% important to reach out to or have the institution connect you with someone who has gone through this process, because the information that they can give is extremely valuable.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. I think just switching gears a little bit, I'm seeing a couple of questions about jobs in academic settings. I'll start off with primary care and hospitalist jobs and then move on to specialty medicine as well. Dr. Rakasi, when you were doing your job search, can you kind of talk a little bit about what your process was? And did you see any jobs out there at academic centers where you could be a teaching attending in either a primary care setting or a hospital medicine setting? Is that something that you considered or factored in?
Honestly, during my job search, either myself or my fellows at that time were not really looking for academic jobs, but we came across some of the academic jobs while we were looking for them in some of the websites or recruitment sites, and they were very little compared to the non-academic jobs. Relatively, there were very few. With some with some administration responsibilities and requiring some experience. So it's not impossible, particularly if you're starting the process early and if you have time in your hand. I think it's not impossible to find it. And you need to be flexible with what your priorities are. So if your priority is to kind of get into one particular location, one particular geographical area, then probably you might be limited. But if you're flexible with your priorities, I don't think it's too difficult to find an academic J1 waiver job.
Okay. And kind of, on the flip side, what about when you were looking into specialty jobs? Like, I think Dr. Edwards is at an academic center. Dr. Cole, I know you're affiliated to an academic center. So if you both can comment a little bit about, how easy or how hard is it to find an academic job, a J1 waiver job?
So I can go ahead first. I would say again, it really certainly depends on if you're geographically limited or not. But let's say, if you are able to apply broadly, I would say it's you want to connect with people who might have had a similar experience, because they can give you an idea of what academic centers may have experienced doing this. So that's one way to start in terms of searching for an academic job specifically. Often the institution that you did fellowship, if that's somewhere that you feel comfortable staying, or you would like to stay based on other limitations, that's also a good way to go about the process as well, thinking about staying at your own academic institution if you did your fellowship training there, and if that's an opportunity, if they're able to do J1 waivers. And so I think there are quite a few options. You just really have to definitely reach out to people who have done this before. I can't say that there's a website or a book that has a list of academic institutions, but certainly having these conversations is one of the best ways to really look out for these places. And if you're particularly interested in clinical practice with a specific disease in your specialty, then there are certainly centers of excellence in this disease which you can also reach out to and see if they serve underserved patients. So I think those are some of the areas. I would say I can't say that I found it difficult, because I was very lucky in that I had persons before me who did this process. And so I was able to find a lot of opportunities that way. Persons sent emails from me or connected me with people via phone. And I even got interviews just through networking and really talking to the right people.
Yeah, I would, just based on those notes, finding a specialty J1 waiver job in an academic setting can get challenging, primarily because a lot of these academic institutions won't advertise their positions. So there is a good chance that the academic centers are actually looking for someone, but they're hoping to either match their fellows, or they're hoping to sort of spread it by word of mouth and get candidates, because they know they can attract that kind of talent. So you may not see these openings on a website, but I think, stressing upon the point that Camille made is talk to your attendings. You never know how academic institutions can make these things work. They may have community affiliate sites. So they may be able to swing your waiver through one of these sites where you serve for the set duration at a satellite facility, and then serve some of your academic time at the main campus, and they can make those things work. And they've probably had experience doing it. If you, obviously, as a part of a specialty training, you have the opportunity to interact with attendings who may have come to that particular center from different regions in the country. They may have connections at sites in different states where someone is looking for a specialist at academic sites. And it always, as you go through specialty, especially the experience I had with infectious disease, the pyramid starts getting narrower as to how many individuals know each other. So it becomes a very small community where everyone knows everyone. And the minute you start talking, you realize, oh, there's someone out in the Midwest, or there's someone down south, and they're looking, and would you be interested? And you never know how things work out. But I think it all boils down to starting really early, so that you're not pressurized into making decisions at the nth hour, where now you're, potentially going to not look at red flags or get rushed into signing something just because you want to be on the right side of the timeline. I think if you want options and you want to score the right one, start early.
Great, thank you. I can't believe we only have about 20 minutes left. The questions keep coming in. But just talking a little bit more about these J1 waiver jobs at academic centers, one of the things that I found was that sometimes institutions can file something called as an O1 visa while waiting for a J1 waiver. Suppose you've gotten an employment opportunity already and they really want to keep you, but they're not able to get the J1 waiver spot. An O1 visa is something that they can do. I think my question, it can be any of the panel members who have experience with this. How extraordinary does one have to be to get an O1?
So I can start off on this one. I think, so in my experience, if you're finishing a residency, especially like a primary care residency, internal medicine, family medicine, and this is your first time doing a residency, right? You didn't have a practice abroad previously. There's some people who come to the United States and have whole second careers here. But I'm talking about somebody who's kind of fresh-faced right out of residency. The likelihood of an O1 approval is going to be pretty low. We do O1s regularly, though, for physicians who are finishing fellowship, because if you are in a relatively academic fellowship and you've published papers and maybe you've won some awards or you've gotten some recognition for yourself, then it can be possible, especially if I shouldn't say especially. It can help also if the job that you're going into is something where they're really looking for your expertise and recruited you because of the great track record or great, background that you have. So the standard for an O1, if you look at the definition, it's, people who have extraordinary ability in their field. There is a list of 8 criteria in the regulation that you need to meet at least 3 of. So a lot of times with physicians, we immigration lawyers will shorthand initially and say, okay, do you have any publications? Because that's usually like the low hanging fruit, right? It's a thing that you would assume somebody who's going to be at the forefront of their field is going to have published scholarly articles. But I've done O's for people who had like 2 articles, but they had really significant achievements outside of that. So I think it really depends on each individual's background, if we think we can make out at least 3 of those regulatory criteria and overall, feel that your application has some heft. So it can be a really good backup. Keep in mind, even if you obtain an O1 and you feel like, woohoo, I'm extraordinary, I got my O1, you still need to deal with this J1 stuff. It doesn't ever go away. Don't leave it too long. Talk to your employer. I mean, I usually will say to an employer, okay, we're doing the O1 for this guy, but we're going to file his waiver in the ensuing fall. We are not leaving this for 5-10 years of him just sitting out there on this O1, not eligible for a green card, and having to renew every year or few years if we can actually transition that doctor to something else. So make sure that your waiver is still going to be taken care of, even if you do the O.
Excellent, thank you. So now I'm going to take some more of the questions that are like pouring in, if I may say. Just talking a little bit about, some state specific questions. We are not going to be specifically addressing each state. However, we know that some states are more competitive than the others. There are some states like Connecticut and Florida, I believe, that do a lottery system rather than a first come, first serve basis for applications. For somebody who may not have geographical limitations, or let's say somebody wants to go to these competitive states, what would you recommend? Or if somebody doesn't have a geographical limitation, would you recommend being more strategic about what states to apply to?
So, let me first say, and the other panelists were talking about this earlier, the most important thing in your job search is finding a job that is professionally appropriate for you, that's going to be fulfilling in an area that you want to live in for at least 3 years. A lot of doctors get tunnel vision on the waiver and they start to ignore some of those red flags we talked about earlier, or they don't even ask about them. So the first thing I want to mention is, especially if you're not geographically limited and you're like, okay, where can I go to get a waiver? There are lots of places you can go to get a waiver. So just keep in mind all of the stuff that was talked about before. If you're not geographically limited and you want to have probably the most predictable path to a waiver, I would probably, if you're a primary care hospitalist with no fellowship training or no more than a year of fellowship training at most, the HHS clinical waiver program is one of the fastest, easiest to navigate waiver programs. And because they have no limit, as long as you are in a qualifying location and a qualifying position, they tend to go through pretty easily. So I would say, and that's a nationwide program, right? You're not geographically limited. So I can do HHS waiver programs in Hawaii, Alaska, and Maine, or Florida, or anywhere else I want to do them because there's no geographic limit. The other program that I really love is the DRA's program. The Delta Regional Authority covers about 250 counties in 7 states: Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Not all of those states, although most of Louisiana, but a good portion of the parts that hug the Mississippi River. And if you know the US geography, you're like, Alabama isn't on the river, but there's parts of Alabama too. They're fantastic. Also, specialist primary care, huge underserved populations down in this region. I live in Memphis, Tennessee. We are in the DRA. Almost all the waivers we file in this region go through the DRA. It's really, a fantastic option if what you're mostly worried about is losing out to a lottery or a very highly subscribed state. If you're not looking for that, if you're looking for, bigger states, bigger cities, not sure, maybe you're a subspecialist, so HHS is out of the question, then you have some harder decisions to make, right? You might decide, look, I really want to be in Texas, but Texas is going to open their program for the first 2 weeks of September and make decisions typically by the end of that month. And they're usually going to fill up pretty quickly. New York gives you a couple months to file between October and November, and they fill up and also take a really long time to make a decision. Both of those states are very friendly to specialists, but you have some issues in terms of timing and availability. So I think, thinking strategically, if that's how I'm thinking, there are states with larger metro areas that don't fill up right away. All of those states that I just mentioned, well, not all of them, a good portion of the states that I just mentioned that are in the DRA don't necessarily fill their waivers. Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama never fill their waiver slots, their Conrad waiver slots. So even if you're not in a DRA area, you may be able to get a waiver in one of those spots. So you could end up outside of Nashville. Not necessarily, if you're not thinking about being in a rural setting, but you want to be somewhere more urban. Nevada doesn't fill all of its waiver slots. Las Vegas, I did a waiver there last year, went through very nicely. Oregon usually has good availability for subspecialists and primary care. I won't say Washington State, that's a little more tricky, but there are, large metros where there is waiver availability. So don't feel like I've got to get a waiver. I'm a little bit too afraid to go to like Florida or Connecticut or, one of the states that's going to fill up like that. But I'm afraid I'm going to be like on Little House on the Prairie, like out in the middle of nowhere somewhere in Montana. And it's not really what I want for myself. There's a happy medium in there. There are smaller and larger cities where there will be waiver availability. And I think I will give a plug to physician career fairs as well. I think participating in career fairs, whether virtually or in person, if they have them in your area, can be really valuable because you get to meet one-on-one with a recruiter who's in-house in that facility. And they can, they may not know all the ins and outs of their own waiver program in their state. They can tell you if they've done them before and help you gauge some of that timing and whether that state or that area is somewhere where you might want to check out. So I definitely think the career fairs are a great option.
Great, thank you. I think one of the questions that we got is, we have a person who is on a J1 visa who recently got married to a US citizen. Are you able to advise on how to apply for a hardship waiver, and will it take too long? Will it affect fellowship application if there's plan to do fellowships?
So yeah, a hardship waiver is available to a physician who's married to a U.S. citizen or permanent resident spouse, or who has a U.S. citizen or permanent resident child, and where complying with the home residence requirement would cause exceptional hardship to that qualifying relative. So to the spouse or the child, not to you, not to you as the J1. Hardship waivers can be really a great option. You don't have to go work in an underserved area. I like them mostly where you're married to a U.S. citizen or permanent resident spouse, because then your spouse, if it's approved, your spouse can directly sponsor you for a green card, and you don't have to worry about, oftentimes you can bypass H-1B status altogether. There are some real benefits to that. Where there's no U.S. citizen or permanent resident spouse and you're proceeding on the basis of a child, that gets trickier because then you're looking for, well, can I get an H-1B at this employer? And that opens up a whole other can of worms. But hardship waivers do take a long time at the Immigration Service, and you really do need to have an individual consultation with an attorney to determine whether your hardship combined with your home country and your situation would qualify. It can be a really good option. The timing I usually like for hardship waivers is applying sometime in the, toward the end of the second to last year of training. So basically, like if you're, PGY3 now and you're going to finish a residency in June, the sweet spot to me to file for a hardship waiver would have been back in like April, May, June of this year. Kind of like right after your DS 2019 for your last year of training would have issued, and then file the hardship waiver. They are taking that long. It's a very lengthy process, but it can be a good option in the right scenario. I'm very particular about when I like those, but you don't need to have an employer lined up. There are some really good benefits. A couple of things to know. If you're not married to a U.S. citizen, and you go through the hardship waiver and it's approved, before you start work, you need to have an employer who's going to sponsor you for some sort of visa, for some sort of immigration status to work in the United States. And you're going to have to depart the United States to go for visa stamping before you start work. So that's a key difference between the hardship waivers and the underserved area waivers we've been talking about. In those cases, you just change status in the U.S. You don't have to make a special trip. It all goes through. And I just like to mention that it's not, for some people, they don't care, it's not I'm not trying to make it sound bad, but I just want to make sure, because a lot of doctors don't know about that difference between the two types of waivers. And it's really, really important to know.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the other questions that we got was, what if you're applying for a fellowship and you do not match? Is it too late to apply for a waiver? I think one of the thoughts that I had was, because there are different agencies that are available, even if there's no Conrad 30, there might be opportunities through DRA or the Appalachian Regional Commission, or maybe the Veterans Affairs as well.
Yeah, that's totally true. And I always say in our office, we have two waiver seasons. We have the fall waiver season that we pretty much get started on in like July or August, right? And we file all the way through the fall. And then we get like the second round in January, February, where we get folks who either didn't match with fellowships, who didn't get their first choice of waiver state, or who were just, it's just taken them a little bit longer to get their act together on their job search. And so that's when they're about to sign a contract. You will not be alone if you're seeking a waiver job in January, February, March. I promise you, there will be other folks out there doing the same thing.
I think that's important. It's always crucial to have a backup plan, and I think that would serve as an answer for both those questions. Whether you don't match for fellowship and now in December first week you're starting to look for waiver jobs, or if you applied somewhere and your name didn't get picked up in the lottery. I think it is helpful. You may not have interviews lined up, or you may not have jobs lined up in the states that may offer those positions. But I think it's always good to do your homework beforehand, just based on the last few year trends. Like, for example, I can speak for New Hampshire. They welcome applications in January because they rarely fill up by December. And even today, when I checked it, they fill 5 out of 20 slots. The flex go quickly, the rest they don't, because it's a predominantly rural state with only Dartmouth Hitchcock being the largest employer. So it's always good to have some of these states at the back of your mind saying, worst case scenario, this is where you narrow down your search so that you're not spending another month trying to figure out a job scene in those particular areas.
My experience particularly is the same thing. I missed out on the fellowship and then I signed my job in March. So it's not really impossible, but as Dr. Kohli and Lisa said, do your homework and have plan B. So having a plan B is one of the important things is apply for your boards for that year. And you can actually do your J1 extension until your boards. So you'll have extra time to kind of work on this process. And at the same time, start working on the state medical license ahead of time. If you know particularly which state you are interested, that will also speed up the things during this process.
Excellent, thank you. We're kind of inching closer towards the 8 p.m. mark. I know it has kind of like really flown by. I'd like to take 2 or 3 more questions and then kind of wrap up this session if some of the panelists don't mind staying behind for another extra 5 to 10 minutes. One of the other questions that we got is the duration of fellowship or doing a non-ACGME accredited fellowship limit your application to the HHS or the Appalachian Regional Commission programs? Do any of you know this information?
For HHS, they have a requirement that you start your waiver job within a year of finishing your residency. So any longer than a 1-year fellowship, you won't qualify for HHS. But for any other waiver program that accepts specialists, they won't care about whether you had an ACGME accredited fellowship. We've done them plenty of times.
Okay. Another question that we got was, is it better to do a J1 waiver job before fellowship or after fellowship? So I think my sense is that perhaps it really depends on the country that you're from and if you're willing to apply for a fellowship on an H-1B visa, which makes it a little bit more restrictive. But I'm curious to see if any of you have any thoughts about it. Dr. Rakasi, did you ever contemplate like applying for fellowship after completing your J1 waiver?
Honestly, from my experience, I would strongly suggest to continue your fellowship dreams right after residency. Once you go through the process of J1 waiver and you really get diluted and you really need to focus for the next 3 years to get back on track with fellowship. So it's always better to kind of continue your fellowship right after residency.
Excellent, thank you. One other question that I personally had was, now, is there an opportunity to pursue any kind of research when you take up a job, or does it have to be all clinical work, 40 hours per week when you take up a job? Because I know a lot of people have aspirations to be involved in clinical research. If you're in subspecialties, be clinical trialists, etc. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
The requirement is that you work full-time in clinical care in furtherance of the waiver, and that's defined as 40 hours a week or 160 hours a month in clinical care. Now, clinical care can include patient charting. It can include like waiting around for lab tests after your shift is over, things like that. It doesn't have to be like the time that you are face-to-face with a patient. However, that time does not include research, teaching, administrative duties, call, travel time. So you have to be aware of that. That doesn't mean you can't do those things. It doesn't mean you can't teach, doesn't mean you can't do research, but just know that those duties or those activities need to come in in addition to your 40-hour a week base work time. And that limit only exists for those first 3 years of your practice, right? Once you finish your 3 years of J1 waiver service, then you have a lot more flexibility. So I have a client right now who finished his waiver service and he reduced his clinical commitment and upped his research commitment with his employer. And everybody's totally fine with that because he doesn't have the J1 stuff hanging over him anymore.
Right. And there's a report also that's sent to the DHS. Is that correct, Alyssa? And so it's a pretty strict requirement.
It depends on the state and the program. Some state have very robust compliance reporting requirements, like Virginia, the DRA. I think Ohio has very, very strict compliance reporting. They want to know everything that you've been doing like every 6 months. Other programs like HHS have no compliance reporting. They're like, okay, we gave you the waiver, our job is done, move along. So it really depends. But even if there's not compliance reporting, it's really key that you fulfill the obligation under the waiver the way you're supposed to, because you're later on when you go to apply for a green card and you're submitting evidence that you completed your waiver service, you don't want there to be any question about whether you actually worked full-time in patient care. You want to know that you have fulfilled that obligation appropriately.
Excellent, thank you. I think we'll do one last question to kind of, round up this session. Let's say you choose to go back to your home country for 2 years, and then you decide you want to come back to the US and find a job. Probably our panelists may not have a lot of experience with it, but any advice on or any insight in terms of how easy to get, is it easy to like try and get a job back again in the US?
I can just talk real quick about how that works. Documentation. Document your time in your home country. Utility bills, leases. If you work there, keep all your pay stubs or whatever evidence that you have that you've been working. Receipts, travel documentation, whatever you have to prove. You don't have to have a piece of paper for every single day that you're in your home country, but definitely pay attention to documenting the time spent in your home country for those 2 years, right? It's not just that you have to be abroad, you have to be in the country that's on that DS 2019. That's where the government's going to assume you'll be. In terms of finding a job, I have had clients find jobs from overseas who did US training, decided to go home for 2 years. Typically, the folks that I've worked with in those scenarios have been hospitalists. They've come back to the United States to be hospitalists. I don't know if there's a reason for that, why that tends to be the most common scenario I've seen. But, typically at that point, you've passed all 3 steps of the USMLE. You may already have had a full medical license here in the US, or you're eligible for one. A lot of the things that you would normally have to worry about in terms of qualifying for a job, you've already done it because you were here for a residency. You just happen to go back home for 2 years. So I think the biggest issue that comes up is the H-1B cap in those instances. So you're going to be looking more for those academic positions, or at least working at some kind of nonprofit academic facility. If you're going to come and work for a staffing company as a hospitalist, that's going to be your biggest hurdle, right? So you're not going to deal with J1 waiver issues. Now you're going to deal with the H1 limitations, but it's doable. And we do a few of those every year for doctors who are abroad.
Yeah, I would just say 2 things. One, keep in touch with your mentors and keep in touch with the facilities you trained at. Secondly, keep in touch with your professional societies. It's extreme because one, it sort of gives you a background on the lay of the land. Things change. It also helps to maintain some of your CME credits if you've not maintained your licensure and you're coming back. And thirdly, I think it still maintains your inroads, because when you keep in touch, when you're in sync with what's going on, it allows you still have some sort of a link left that they'll think of you or remember you if there's an option opening and you're considering that option. I think maintaining those relations go a long way.
And in the broader context, just for those who are looking for an academic job, the same applies, really, just in terms of networking and keeping connections strong.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Panelists, I want to know if you have one last parting advice for our members, just even a single thing that you can think of, or the best advice that you got, or some advice that you want people to take with them at the end of this session.
Well, I would say
we'll start one by one.
Sure. Oh, I can go ahead. Sure.
Sure.
So I would say to everyone that's listening that for those who haven't started the process yet, starting early when you do get to that point is extremely important. And that is in terms of looking for your job, but also connecting with people and letting people know that this is the process that you're going through. So starting early, I really strongly recommend. for those who may be, I think, looking for J1 waiver jobs starting, I believe, in probably June 2023. Now is the time to really start looking around.
Great, thank you.
I would say become members of ACP because they organize such glorious sessions and webinars. And I would also put in a shameless plug for New Hampshire. Come over. It is rural, but it's beautiful.
Well done,
Yeah.
Dr. Kohli. I did not bribe him to say that. All right, Dr. Akasi.
Yeah, as everybody said, timing is important. Start early. And if you're planning for fellowship or anything, have plan A and plan B. And having an experienced immigration attorney by your side through the process is really important because it's a very complex process. And better choose an employer familiar with the process as well.
I really don't have a lot to add to all of that. I mean, they all took what I was going to say. It's all great advice. I think the fact that you all are here watching this and trying to learn is a great first step. But to echo, it's never too early to look for your waiver job. Don't have tunnel vision on the waiver. Make good professional decisions and get reputable advice. I mean, I think those are really the key takeaways.
Great. I would like to thank all of you for your invaluable advice and for spending time with all of us today to talk about this process. I know we were not able to answer all the questions that came through, but we tried to kind of highlight at least the most important points. To all the members who are out there, we would love some feedback. If you're looking for any additional sessions or anything like that, please reach out to us. To Linda Layer, who is our chapter coordinator. But once again, thank you all for joining us today. It was wonderful to have you all. This was a great and robust discussion, and we hope to bring many more informative sessions for all of you.